There's a movement happening right now that does not make headlines. It does not have a press conference. It does not have a spokesman. It does not announce itself on the front pages of financial newspapers or in the statements of central bank governors. It moves in cargo planes, in armored convoys, in quiet diplomatic channels between finance ministries that never appear on public schedules. Central banks around the world are taking their gold back, not all at once, not loudly, but consistently, deliberately, and at a pace that has no precedent in the modern financial era. And if you know what this movement has meant every single time it has appeared in history, you understand why the silence around it is the most important part. In 1967, Charles de Gaulle stood before the French press and said something that the architects of the post-war financial order had dreaded hearing. He said the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency was an exorbitant privilege, that America was printing money, spending beyond its means, and asking the rest of the world to absorb the cost, that France had accumulated too many paper promises and too little of what those promises were supposed to represent. And then he did something that no allied nation had done since the Bretton Woods system was constructed. He sent ships. French cargo vessels crossed the Atlantic and returned with gold. Physical gold, pulled from the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, where France, like most of the world, had been storing its reserves since 1944. De Gaulle repatriated 3,000 tons over several years. He converted France's dollar holdings into metal, into something that did not depend on American fiscal discipline, into something that could not be printed. Other countries watched, Germany watched, Italy watched. The smaller nations of the Bretton Woods system watched a founding member of the Western Alliance send ships for its gold and wondered what de Gaulle knew that they did not. 4 years later, Nixon closed the gold window. The system de Gaulle had identified as structurally unsound collapsed exactly as he had suggested it would. The ships were not a provocation. They were a diagnosis. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York sits on the bedrock of Lower Manhattan, 5 stories below street level. Its vaults hold what was, for most of the 20th century, the largest accumulation of gold in human history, not because it belonged to America, but because the world's central banks had chosen to store it there. This was not an accident of geography. It was an expression of trust. After 1945, the logic was straightforward. The United States had emerged from the Second World War as the world's dominant economic and military power. The dollar was backed by gold at a fixed rate. American institutions were stable, American vaults were secure, and the cost of moving gold across oceans was high enough that proximity to New York's financial markets made storage there the rational choice. Trust, when it functions, creates convenience. When trust erodes, convenience stops mattering. In 2012, Germany's Federal Audit Court published a report that created a quiet crisis in the offices of the Bundesbank. The report noted that Germany's gold, approximately 3,400 tons, the second largest national gold reserve in the world, was stored primarily in New York, London, and Paris. The German auditors had not physically inspected the gold in decades. They had relied on assurances. The report recommended verification. What followed was one of the most significant, least covered financial stories of the early 21st century. Germany announced it would repatriate 674 tons of gold from New York and Paris by 2020. The operation took 7 years. It required the construction of new storage facilities inside Germany. It was conducted with the kind of operational security usually associated with military movements. When it was complete, Germany's finance minister stood before the Bundestag and said something that, if you listened carefully, contained everything you needed to understand about the state of the global financial system. He said, Germany's gold is now safe. Safe. The implication of that word applied to gold stored in an allied nation's central bank was not subtle. It was not reassuring. It was the sound of a calculation being made, quietly, officially, and for the record, about where trust now resided. Gold has functioned as a monetary anchor for approximately 5,000 years. This is not a mystical claim. It is an empirical one. Civilizations across continents and centuries with no contact with each other independently arrived at gold as the substance most suited to store and transfer value. Its properties, scarcity, durability, divisibility, the impossibility of creating it from cheaper materials, made it the natural solution to the problem of how to maintain trust in exchange over time. Empires debased their currencies. Rome mixed copper into its silver denarius as fiscal pressure mounted, reducing the silver content from nearly 100% in the first century to less than 5% by the third. The population responded not with panic, but with adjustment. hoarding older coins, pricing goods higher, withdrawing from long-distance commerce that depended on monetary stability. The debasement did not cause the collapse of the Roman economy, but it was the fingerprint of a system under stress. It was the sign that the empire could no longer maintain the promises embedded in its currency. Every monetary collapse in history has left the same fingerprint, the face value maintained, the real value quietly, steadily eroding. Those who understood moved toward something the issuing authority could not manipulate, toward gold. This is not a new strategy. It is the oldest surviving financial strategy in human history. And right now, it is being executed simultaneously by central banks, holding nearly half the world's foreign exchange reserves. The numbers are not hidden. They are published quarterly by the World Gold Council, compiled from central bank disclosures, available to anyone who looks. What they show is a pattern that has no precedent in the modern financial era. Central banks, as a group, have been net buyers of gold every year since 2010. Before 2010, they were net sellers. For decades, through the 1980s and 1990s, central banks sold gold. They sold it because they believed, or were advised, that gold was an anachronism, that modern financial instruments were more efficient, that the dollar system was stable enough that holding gold was an unnecessary cost. The shift in 2010 was not a policy announcement. It was a behavioral change, and behavioral changes in institutions that move slowly, that govern their decisions by committee, that are staffed by economists who publish their reasoning. Those changes mean something different than behavioral changes in markets driven by sentiment. When a central bank buys gold, it is not speculating. It is reallocating. It is making a structural judgment about what belongs in a reserve portfolio designed to function across decades and across political cycles. The countries leading the accumulation are not random. China has been adding to its gold reserves consistently, though its actual holdings are almost certainly larger than officially reported. China has a history of announcing gold purchases in tranches, years after the fact. Russia built its gold reserves from approximately 400 tons in 2007 to over 2,300 tons before Western sanctions complicated its position. India has been accelerating its purchases. Poland doubled its gold holdings. Hungary multiplied its gold reserves by 10. Turkey, despite significant currency pressure, has maintained and expanded its gold position. None of these are coincidences. None of these are independent decisions made by finance ministries that happen to reach the same conclusion at the same time for unrelated reasons. This is a coordinated, if unspoken, reassessment of what the global reserve system actually guarantees. Understand what a reserve currency requires to function. It is not simply a question of which currency is most widely used in trade. It is a question of what promises are embedded in that currency, and whether the institution issuing it can keep those promises across political cycles and geopolitical shifts. The dollar's reserve status rests on several pillars. American financial markets are the deepest and most liquid in the world. Treasury bonds represent the world's largest pool of supposedly risk-free assets. The United States has been the guarantor of the rules-based order within which the dollar system operates. Remove any one of these pillars, and the others weaken. When American debt reaches levels that raise legitimate questions about long-term fiscal sustainability, and it has, the risk-free designation of Treasury bonds becomes a matter of faith rather than arithmetic. When the United States uses dollar access as a geopolitical weapon, freezing Russian central bank reserves, imposing sanctions that cut countries off from SWIFT, every central bank in the world receives the same message simultaneously. Dollar reserves are not neutral assets. They are instruments of American foreign policy. They can be confiscated. They can be frozen. They can disappear by executive order. Gold cannot be frozen. Gold cannot be sanctioned. Gold does not have a SWIFT code. Gold stored in your own vault, in your own country, on your own soil, answers to no foreign government's policy. This is the calculation that every central bank outside the Western Alliance has been making since 2022, and the gold purchases reflect it with mathematical precision. The history of reserve currency transitions is longer than most people realize and more orderly than most people fear until the final phase. The Portuguese escudo gave way to the Spanish real, which gave way to the Dutch guilder, which gave way to the pound sterling, which gave way to the dollar. Each transition took decades. Each was preceded by a long period in which the incumbent currency remained dominant while its structural foundations quietly eroded. Debt accumulated. The gap between promises and the capacity to honor them widened. In each case, the signal was not a dramatic announcement. The signal was in the behavior of those who managed large stores of value across long time horizons. They moved slowly, deliberately, without fanfare, toward the asset that did not depend on any single institution's continued competence or integrity. The Bank of England's position as the anchor of the global reserve system did not collapse in a single event. It eroded across 40 years of accumulated fiscal strain, 2 world wars, and the gradual recognition by the holders of sterling reserves that the institution backing those reserves was no longer the unchallenged center of global economic gravity. The shift from sterling to dollar was complete, institutionally at Bretton Woods in 1944, but the process had been visible in the data for 2 decades before that conference. The question we're sitting with is not whether a similar process is underway now. The question is where in that process we currently are. Systems do not announce their transitions. They accumulate stress until the stress becomes visible. The gold repatriation wave is visible. Germany returned its gold. The Netherlands quietly moved a significant portion of its reserves to domestic storage. Austria repatriated gold from London. Belgium reviewed its storage arrangements. These are not peripheral economies making idiosyncratic decisions. These are the core economies of the European Union, America's closest and oldest allies, deciding that physical proximity to their own reserves matters in a way it did not when the system felt more stable. And outside the Western alliance, the accumulation is accelerating in ways that the quarterly reports capture, but that rarely translate into the kind of analysis that reaches general audiences. Central banks are not buying gold because they expect the dollar to collapse next quarter. They are buying gold because they are managing portfolios across 20, 30, 50-year horizons. And across those horizons, the arithmetic of dollar dominance looks different than it does in any given news cycle. They are buying gold for the same reason that de Gaulle sent ships in 1967, not because the system has already failed, because they can see where the stress is concentrated, because they have read the history of what happens when reserve currency systems reach the point where the promises exceed the capacity to honor them. They are not panicking, they are preparing. Empires rarely understand their own transitions while they are happening. The Roman treasury officials who managed the debasement of the denarius were not blind to what they were doing. They were solving immediate problems, funding military campaigns, paying the bureaucracy, managing fiscal shortfalls, with the tools available to them. The long-term consequences were visible to contemporary observers. They were documented. They were argued about in the Senate. The British Treasury officials who managed sterling's long decline from global reserve currency were not incompetent. They were navigating genuine constraints, war debts, imperial overextension, the structural realities of a changed world, with the instruments at their disposal. The trajectory was visible. It was measured. It was discussed in the corridors of Whitehall and in the pages of The Economist. Transitions are not hidden. They are simply easier to see when you are not inside the system being transformed. The gold is moving. It has been moving for more than 15 years, steadily, consistently in one direction, away from the concentrated storage arrangements that expressed mid-20th century trust, and toward the distributed, nationally controlled arrangements that express something else. It is expressing a recalculation, a quiet judgment about where the guarantees reside, of which promises are likely to be kept, of what belongs in a reserve portfolio designed not for the next quarter, but for the next era. The ships that crossed the Atlantic in 1967 did not sink the Bretton Woods system. The system sank because the system had already failed to maintain the conditions that made it credible. The ships were the signal. not the cause. They were never the cause. The question history always asks, after the transition has become obvious, after the textbooks have been written and the careful postmortems conducted, is never what caused the system to fail. The question, the one that has always mattered, is who saw the signal and what they chose to do.